This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and before we start, we have a small request. If you like us, please show it. We need your support. Please give to our show by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and you'll see a big red button that says Patreon. Click on it and support us. We're counting on you. My guest today is a historian of science and the chair of the graduate program in science, technology and society at Bar-Ilan University. That is the department that, incidentally, was started by our fellow TLV1 broadcaster Noah Ephron. Oren Harman is the author of the new book, Evolutions, 15 Myths That Explain Our World. It was recently published in English by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. And he's also the director of Leer Institute's Talking About Science in the 21st Century lecture series. Professor Oren Harman, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So if there's one thing that scientific development was supposed to give us, it's certainty. That we no longer need to rely on myths about gods and demons to explain the way the natural world works. As you write, and I quote, "Science pretends to be a replacement for mythology, but in reality it is driven by the same hunger for understanding that brought us the gods and the afterlife, souls and creation myths, and it too is shaped by myths." Please explain.
Well, ask anyone who has surfed the web on a transatlantic flight at 30,000 feet or popped a Ritalin before they enter an important interview just after eating a genetically modified apple or just looked at their unborn baby through an ultrasound, and they'll tell you science is the most amazing, almost miraculous thing that we know. It's an incredibly powerful method to learn about ourselves and about the world and also to control the elements around us. And yet, a lot of people have a kind of intuitive reaction. Not everyone, a lot of people don't. But some people have an intuitive reaction against the scientific pretension for complete and total understanding, against the notion that knowledge equals wisdom, that information is tantamount to knowledge, and so forth. So a lot of people understand that questions like, how does a gene work? Or how is a planet born in a galaxy are not the same as what is the meaning of life and is it good or bad and so forth. So
is your book essentially a call for modesty?
It is a call for modesty because modern science, as it's told in the narrative, the history of science, beginning, say, in the 16th or 17th century, had this kind of pretense to be a replacement for age-old stories. All peoples always tried to touch their existential conundrums. They always tried to sort of reach these absolute truths. And the new scientists said, well, we've developed a method which allows for a kind of objective knowledge which was not apparent, was not in use before us. And so we could replace mythology, we could replace mysticism, we can replace religion. And in a sense, the new science became a new religion onto its own, which in many ways is a very good thing because, as I've said, science and its handmaiding technology, and increasingly it's more and more difficult to separate between the two, are changing the world for the better. More people live longer lives, more mouths are fed. We have the Internet of Things and knowledge at our fingertips. It really is miraculous, and we're very, very grateful for the fruits of science. And yet, when we confuse this kind of control and these kinds of tools which make our lives better with things like happiness, then we're making a mistake. And we might be setting ourselves up for a crash.
Do you think there are scientists that are pretending to have cracked the secret of happiness?
There's no question. There's an entire cottage industry today called happiness studies. We have a doctoral student in our department who's actually studying the birth and evolution of happiness studies.
And they are hard scientists, but biologists and, physicists, or? philosophers and
it started
social scientists?
with psychologists, but there are surely. I mean, positivism is the bastion of positivism has always been amongst first and foremost physical scientists, especially physicists who think that if you could locate every atom or quark and understand its trajectory, then you can basically explain human history. So that kind of positivism is a tradition which is well known to the world. And more than once, it's had to deal with the hard facts of reality and sort of gotten a bruise on its nose. Now, the difficult part is to hold two birds in one hand. On the one hand, to celebrate science, and on the other hand, to develop a kind of modesty about what kinds of questions can be answered with scientific tools and which kinds are outside of its purview.
So don't you think you run the risk of throwing away the baby with the bathwater? I mean, by saying there are limits to science, therefore it invites all sorts of people who are climate change deniers or, creationists, saying, no. The theory of evolution is not this, truth that we all brought up to believe. It actually has its limitations.
Right. Well, I mean, you run the risk of hurting yourself by living, So you just have to be very clear about what you say and how you communicate it. And you need more than a soundbite, which is increasingly difficult in this modern world. But no, I mean, when the movement of the critique of science was born in the 60s and 70s, what those people were saying was they weren't saying that there's no such thing as reality. But what they were saying was, most people think that scientific facts and scientific entities like quarks and genes and prions are just out there to be discovered. And what the critique of science was saying was that's not exactly true. That's not a precise description of how things work. More close to reality is the following description. Scientific facts are networked. They are less a description of reality and more a product of the scientific process. And so the veracity of facts don't stand or fall based on some kind of inherent veracity, but rather on the strength of the networks that produce them. So think about it historically. For 1,000 years, the smartest people looking at the heavens were sure that there had to be epicycles to regularize the motions of the heavenly bodies. For 1,000 years and more, the smartest people looking up into the heavens thought there had to be an ether to carry the waves of light. Aristotle was sure that women have less teeth than men. Now, these were the smartest people. Everyone thought of them as, if we want to know something about the truth of the universe, let's go to these people. They'll tell us. Now, from a modern perspective, it's kind of a mistake to say they were just wrong. That's too facile. It's too easy. You want to scream, Aristotle, just open your wife's mouth. Look at, count the teeth. What are you, crazy? But the truth of the matter, the fact of the number of teeth in a woman's mouth had to do with that time's understanding of what a woman is compared to a man. And the fact of the epicycles had to do with Christian notions of harmony and circularity and so forth that were deeply embedded in the culture, in the philosophy of the times. And it's often very difficult for us to see the philosophy and culture of our times. It's like that David Foster Wallace story about the two little fishies that are swimming up a river, and they come across an older fish, and he says, "Top of the morning to you lads. How's the water this morning?" And they continue, and they're swimming. Then one little fishy turns to the other and says, "What water is he talking about?" So it's very, very difficult for us to see how we are embedded, how our values are embedded in our times. But the times change. The times change, and our values change with them. And that goes for science and scientific description as well.
So in 50 or 100 years' time, will the theory of evolution not be, this universal truth? I mean, what do you say to people who say that evolution and creationism are on an equal footing?
Well, I say that they're wrong.
But don't they say, well, you are just, a figment of your times? I mean, this is, what the you were led to believe because of, the culture of the 20th century. And, who knows whether in 100 or 200 years' time we'll go back to the same kind of understanding we had 200 or 300 years ago.
Right. So let's take the brain. Okay, so the brain in the 16th century was thought of as an hydraulic system in miniature encased in our skulls. In the 17th century, it became this very ornate mechanical clock. In the 19th century, it was like a telegraph switchboard. In the 20th century, it became a neural network, and today we speak of it as a quantum computer. Each one of those entities was a different entity of which we ask different questions. So yes, the way we describe what we're interested in the world changes with the language of the times and the ethics of the time and so forth. That doesn't necessarily mean that the description is wrong in any sense. And in fact, science, even though it's a game of sort of storytelling, it's a game of competitive storytelling. And competitive storytelling, unlike art, or different forms of art like music or painting or writing, has a kind of convergence to it. The laws are clearer for what you can say and, get away with it. You need to convince a body of like-trained scientists and so forth. There needs to be consensus. So I know it's a complex thought that we might have theories that we will replace 100 years from now, but which are good enough to help us fly planes and pop pills that change our behavior. And so, take the gene, for instance. I just wrote this piece called Cherish Your Genes, They'll Soon Be Gone. And the idea was, now we use a term called gene, which we've invented. Gene comes from the Latin for sort of the root of everything. Everything comes out of the gene.
Like Genesis.
Right. Mm-hmm. It really helps us explain a lot of things and synthesize drugs and take a characteristics out of a plant and put it into another plant and so on and so forth, which is amazing. It's magic. On the other hand, it's not crazy to think that in 100 years' time, we will find a different kind of description of what we're interested in that will hold the facts that we can observe more strongly. And then we'll just say, we don't need the gene anymore. So when someone comes up to me and says, creationism versus evolution, I say, well, actually, we scientists observe the world, and we have very powerful tools that allow us to do so. And based on those observations, the best explanation that we hold at this moment is evolution, whereas there's good reason to believe that creationism is probably false.
So by mythology, you don't really mean a fabrication, you mean just the way we tell a story, it's a narrative.
Well, I mean, the Greeks believed in their myths. They believed in Hera and Zeus and in the Minotaur. They believed that these were real stories that helped them understand the world, just as we believe in our science. Now, again...
But then there was no kernel of truth in it, whereas, as you say, in our science, now there's more than a kernel of truth.
Again, what science does, it doesn't describe the world or reality directly. It doesn't even observe the world directly.
It's a language.
Right, it's a language. We can only observe through the neurological apparatus that we've inherited through a long process of evolution and, survival of the fittest, natural selection, and chance and luck. But we don't try to describe reality directly. Rather, we create a model of reality and we give names to entities. And then that story helps us understand what we're interested in.
Are you offering a similar critique to the kind of challenge that postmodernism posed to the understanding of truth as an unequivocal derivative of reason? I mean, is it similar?
I've never been a great fan of postmodernism, but there were certain insights that were worthwhile listening to. So on the scientific side, we always think of fact and value as completely separate. But in the creation of our facts, a lot of values play a role. And so in that sense, that was an idea that was worthwhile listening to, and it's borne out by a lot of wonderful historical and sociological research. And I think, by the way, interestingly, scientists are coming around to this notion more and more, because scientists now believe that the strategy for a long time was to say, just the facts, ma'am. And you guys are all about politics and agenda. But that doesn't work in a kind of post-truth world. It doesn't, facts are completely called into question all the time. It's who screams louder, who's more effective in getting across their message. And so if say, for instance, climate scientists want to make a claim about where our planet is going and how we need to save it, let them be passionate together with the facts. Let them be persuasive. That will catch people's ears. Let them show that there is a connection between facts and values, rather than claiming that facts are completely sort of clean. They aren't. And if we believe that they are, then I think that we're sort of tricking ourselves.
How do you stand in relation to Thomas Kuhn's seminal study, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that essentially argued that science progresses not through a linear exploration of truth and fact, but rather, is clearly affected by the culture around it?
Well, he said that the rate of the progression of science is the rate of human funerals. Meaning that, scientists and the scientific community have a stake in a certain, what he called a paradigm. And everyone sort of, their careers have been built on that stake in the paradigm. And the journals that they create, give expression to the paradigm and so on and so forth. And then within the paradigm, there are all kinds of anomalies. You suddenly discover facts that don't exactly sit well with the theory, with the paradigm. So what do you do with them? For a long, long time, you sort of just, explain them away. You say, yeah, but, and na. Until the point where the anomalies are so large that they overturn the paradigm, and then that happens should happen very quickly. How quickly does it happen? It happens at the rate of the funeral of those who were funerals who were invested in the paradigm. Now, I think that is, he came from physics. Tom Kuhn came from physics, and he was explaining sort of the history of physics. And I think that his explanation, minus the fact that he didn't put in technology all that much, which is kind of important and changes the story a little bit, and objects.
How so?
Well, it's like alongside observation and theory, it's a third kind of part of the story that plays an important role because it's a limiting factor. You can only do what you can with the tools that you have at hand, and the tools also sort of determine in which direction you look and under, what light you see the coin and so forth. So that was a little bit missing with him and has been filled in since. But I think he was explaining physics. It looks differently in biology. I don't think it's a kind of an theory, but there was, again, a sort of kernel of truth to what he was saying, that we would like, or for a long time we thought of scientists as sort of like these kind of mediums that just channeled truths at us about the objective world, and failed to understand that scientists, just like artists and journalists and jugglers and swimmers, are people who have feelings and, agenda, and they're not always aware of them. But in really interesting ways, these kind of things find themselves seeping into scientific theories and even into the way we observe the world.
So he too was subscribing to this dichotomy between fact and value? Is that what you're saying?
Probably more than he should have.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's move now to the lecture series at the Van Leer Institute, which is called Talking About Science in the 21st Century. So essentially, it is meant to explore the same issues that you've explored in your career. Tell us about it. What kind of elements did you put together?
So again, the overarching theme of this series is to say, how can we, especially in a day today, where in our day and age today, where with mass media and kind of Trumpian kind of post-truth, although I don't like that word post-truth, as if there was ever a time when there was truth, and now we're in post-truth.
You're only making things more complicated.
I sort of don't think that that's true. But that in this day and age when, everyone can say anything, and, the louder you scream, the more people will hear you and so forth, how do we sort of return to a kind of decent agreement among decent citizens that there are certain kind of things that we can agree upon, and then argue over and above that agreement, rather than, there's just enormous chaos. So in other words, how can we celebrate science and the fruits of science and technology without, wanting to return to become Luddites or something like that, or just crazy, like whackhead, postmodernists, while at the same time, recognizing that there were certain truths about that critique that are important and that help us understand the world. So under that umbrella, which is extremely, extremely, extremely broad, I created this series at Van Leer, which brings to Van Leer once a month on a Wednesday evening someone super interesting, whether from science, from technology, from the arts, from anywhere really, who has something to say about science, technology, the arts, and the relation to culture. And so we started out last year, the first series was devoted to the question of the history of the fact. And my guest there was Professor Oren Harman, who just recently passed away, who was a dear member of our community and a wonderful human being. So we're all very saddened by his passing. But he sort of presented to some degree what we're talking about now, how facts became how facts were hardened.
He was a political scientist.
He was a political scientist who thought a lot about the role of science and technology in the modern polity in relation to power. That was the first one. Then the second one, I talked about my book, Evolution's 15 Myths That Explain Our World, and tried to show how even though myth and science are different in very important ways, they're also similar in ways that are kind of surprising. Then I brought an archaeologist, Israel Finkelstein from University of Tel Aviv, and the writer Aleph Bet Yoshua to talk about the myths of the Bible, or our Jewish nationhood myths, and the archaeological record, and how we should understand the fact that they don't always sort of overlap. And it was really interesting because Israel, who spent his life trying to show that there is actually a problem with the overlap, said that the myths are nevertheless really important. They're crucial to us. Whereas Aleph Bet Yoshua, as a writer, said, you can draw a direct line from Har Sinai to Auschwitz. And what he was trying to say is the myths are our downfall. They are our tragedy. We need to chuck them out. So the man of science was saying, hold on to the myths. The humanist was saying, throw the myths out. That was a really interesting and sort of wild night because people were screaming from the audience. And we like to get, so every time about 200, 250 people come, sometimes more. And we're trying to broaden the audience in Jerusalem, which normally has very nice kind of older people from the neighborhood. But we're trying to, to push out to kids and high school children and artists and technologists.
And podcast listeners from around the world.
There you go.
Yeah.
We also had a roboticist from Cornell who tries to create robots that are increasingly more human-like. And what's interesting is as we humans become more regimented by our technologies, we actually want our technologies more human-like. So what does that say about our humanness versus, intelligent design, artificial intelligence and its quest to become, more and more like humans? We had Darwin's great biographer, Janet Brown from Harvard, come speak about Darwin's afterlives, and she showed really beautifully how the way we understand Darwin says more about our age than about Darwin himself. And also the way we understand the theory says more about our age than about what he had to say about the theory. And this year, we started out the series, again, with a very kind of dramatic juxtaposition between two linguists, one of whom claims that we don't speak Hebrew but Israeli, and the other one claims that we speak Hebrew very much so. And again, whenever you talk about language, it's very much tied to identity, and there were, shouts from the audience and a lot of action.
Do you think that there will be at some point an end to science? Because as you say, there are some things that science is simply unable to crack, like happiness and the meaning of life and stuff like that. And with the progression of scientific technology, we know more and more about the things we can explore. Is there a cap to it?
I don't think so. I think that our curiosity is one of our most basic and fundamental characteristics as a species. And I think that it stems from the fact that we can imagine infinity, and at the same time, we are very conscious of death, of the certainty of death. And that juxtaposition between being able to imagine anything and knowing that we are finite kind of really characterizes our species and will forever make us a curious ape. I think that's a wonderful thing. And so, no, science is here to stay. It just changes with time. And again, the myths were kind of science for the Greeks. The Cro-Magnon man who painted these beautiful bison and leopards in the caves in Northern Europe, that was a kind of science, a kind of attempt to understand the world. And today we try to understand the world with our tools, and it's just going to go on and on and on.
All right. Professor Oren Harman, a historian of science and the chair of the graduate program in Science, Technology and Society at Bar-Ilan University, the author of Evolution's 15 Myths That Explain Our World, and the director of the lecture series talking about science in the 21st century that is at the Leer Institute. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you so much, Gilad.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shelem, our producer, and of course to the Leer Institute for their generous support. My co-host Dalia Shenlin will be back with us shortly, and in the meantime we have a request for you. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to write us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 500 interviews. If you like what we do here, also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. And don't forget to follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.